There's a pattern that certain people exhibit that confuses and frustrates those around them. They're present, engaged, seemingly connected, and then suddenly, without explanation or warning, they're gone. They stop responding. They withdraw. They disconnect completely. There's no argument, no conflict, no obvious trigger. One day they're there, the next day they've vanished, leaving others bewildered and often hurt by the abrupt absence. This isn't ghosting in the casual dating sense. It's something deeper, more psychological, more profound. It's a shutdown mechanism that activates when certain psychological thresholds are crossed, when the psyche determines that continued engagement would be harmful or unsustainable. So what's really happening when you disconnect without warning? What internal mechanism triggers this sudden withdrawal? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who himself withdrew from society during crucial periods of his life and who understood that withdrawal serves essential psychological functions, teach us about why some people must suddenly disconnect to preserve their psychological integrity? To understand this, we need to start with what Jung called the energy economy of the psyche. Jung viewed the psyche as an energy system where every interaction, every thought, every emotion consumes psychic energy. This energy is finite. You have only so much available, and when it's depleted, psychological functioning collapses. Jung wrote extensively about how people must choose where their energy goes and what happens when energy is drained faster than it can be regenerated. When you disconnect without warning, you're often experiencing sudden recognition that your energy has been depleted to critical levels. The interaction, relationship, or situation has been draining you more than you consciously realized. Your psyche has been operating at energy deficit, drawing on reserves that are now exhausted. The shutdown mechanism activates not as deliberate choice, but as emergency response, the psyche's way of stopping the drain before complete collapse occurs. People who disconnect without warning often have poor awareness of their own energy levels until they reach crisis point. They give and give, engaging and responding, not noticing the progressive depletion until suddenly they hit empty. The disconnect isn't planned or desired. It's automatic protective shutdown when reserves are exhausted. Jung would recognize this as the psyche's wisdom, protecting itself from complete breakdown even when conscious awareness failed to recognize the danger. There's also something crucial about what Jung called projection and how becoming conscious of it triggers withdrawal. Jung introduced the concept that people constantly project onto others what they refuse to see in themselves. We see in others what exists in our own shadow. We react to others based on our own unconscious material rather than their actual reality. When you suddenly disconnect from someone without warning, you've often become abruptly conscious of projection dynamics at work. You suddenly see that the relationship has been based on projection rather than genuine connection. Perhaps you've been seeing in them qualities that were actually your own shadow material. Perhaps they've been projecting heavily onto you, and you've suddenly become conscious that they're not seeing you at all, but only their own psychological content. This recognition can be so disorienting and disturbing that immediate withdrawal feels like the only possible response. You can't continue relating once you've seen that genuine relating hasn't actually been happening. People who disconnect without warning have often experienced this sudden recognition of projection dynamics. The withdrawal isn't rejection of the other person. It's response to the recognition that genuine relationship hasn't existed, only mutual projection. Let's also consider what Jung understood about what he called necessary withdrawal and its role in psychological development. Contemporary analysis of Jung's ideas emphasizes that as a person becomes more conscious, their participation in an often unconscious society can become psychologically and even physically painful. Jung himself described the feeling as being awake in a room full of people talking in their sleep. This isn't metaphorical discomfort. It's actual psychological and somatic pain caused by the gap between your consciousness level and others' unconsciousness. When you disconnect without warning, you're often responding to this pain. You've reached a point where continued engagement with unconscious patterns, unconscious people, or unconscious dynamics has become literally painful. Your nervous system is registering threat. Your psyche is screaming for relief. The shutdown mechanism activates to stop the pain, to create the distance necessary for your psychological system to regulate and recover. People who disconnect without warning are often more conscious than those they're disconnecting from, and the consciousness gap has created unsustainable pain that requires immediate separation. Jung would validate this withdrawal as psychologically necessary rather than socially problematic, understanding that consciousness cannot sustain prolonged immersion in unconsciousness without damage. There's also something profound about what Jung called the shadow, and how shadow material triggers sudden withdrawal. The shadow contains everything we've repressed, denied, or refused to acknowledge about ourselves. When shadow material is activated in relationships, when someone touches aspects of our shadow that we're not ready to face, the response can be sudden, complete withdrawal. Perhaps the person you disconnect from represents shadow qualities you can't acknowledge. Perhaps they're mirroring aspects of yourself that you find intolerable. Perhaps the relationship is forcing you to confront shadow material that you're not psychologically prepared to integrate. When shadow material is activated beyond your capacity to manage it, the psyche's protective response is shutdown and withdrawal. You disconnect not because you consciously choose to, but because continuing would force shadow confrontation that would overwhelm you. People who disconnect without warning often have powerful, unintegrated shadow material that gets activated in certain relationships. The sudden withdrawal protects them from shadow confrontation they're not ready for. Jung would understand this as defensive but potentially necessary protection, recognizing that shadow integration must happen at a pace the psyche can tolerate, and that premature, forced confrontation can cause psychological damage rather than growth. Jung also understood something about what he called complexes and how they hijack behavior. Complexes are emotionally charged groups of ideas and memories in the unconscious that can dominate our actions and create repetitive patterns. When a complex is activated, it essentially takes over, operating with its own autonomous energy and agenda. When you disconnect without warning, a complex has often been activated. Perhaps an abandonment complex, a betrayal complex, a suffocation complex, some emotionally charged pattern from your history that gets triggered by current circumstances. Once the complex is activated, conscious, rational control is diminished. The complex drives behavior according to its own logic, which often involves immediate withdrawal to avoid re-experiencing the original wounding that created the complex. People who disconnect without warning often have powerful complexes that get activated in relationships. The sudden withdrawal isn't conscious decision. It's the complex protecting itself, operating according to patterns established in formative wounding experiences. You might consciously want to stay engaged, but the activated complex overrides conscious intention and forces withdrawal. Jung would work therapeutically to make these complexes conscious rather than just trying to change the withdrawal behavior, understanding that until the complex is integrated, it will continue to hijack behavior in similar circumstances. There's also something significant about what Jung called individuation and how it sometimes requires ruthless separation. Individuation is the process of becoming your authentic, unique self, and Jung recognized that this process often requires what looks like selfishness or social violation from the outside. You must sometimes separate from people, communities, and ways of being that prevent your authentic development. even when those separations hurt others or appear inexplicable. When you disconnect without warning, you're often responding to an unconscious recognition that the relationship or situation is preventing your individuation. Something essential in you knows that continued engagement would require abandoning your authentic development, conforming to expectations that violate your nature, or maintaining connections that drain the energy you need for your own becoming. The shutdown mechanism activates to protect your individuation process from relationships or dynamics that threaten it. People who disconnect without warning are often in crucial phases of individuation, where their psyche must ruthlessly prioritize their own development over social harmony or others' expectations. The withdrawal appears selfish from outside, but is actually the psyche's wisdom, choosing essential development over comfortable connection. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the self and how disconnection serves its purposes. The self, in Jung's psychology, is the organizing center of the total personality, the deep source of meaning and direction. The ego doesn't always understand what the self requires, and the self will sometimes force behavior that ego consciousness doesn't comprehend or approve. When you disconnect without warning, the self has often determined that withdrawal is necessary even when your conscious ego doesn't understand why. The self sees larger patterns, longer timescales, and deeper necessities that ego consciousness misses. It knows that this person, this situation, this dynamic must be left behind for reasons that won't become clear until much later. The sudden withdrawal is the self-overriding ego's social concerns to serve deeper developmental necessities. People who disconnect without warning often have strong self-ego relationships, where the self can assert its wisdom even against conscious understanding or social appropriateness. They're trusting the deeper wisdom even when they can't explain or justify it rationally. Jung spent significant time following self-guidance that appeared irrational or socially inappropriate, understanding that the self's wisdom exceeds ego's limited perspective. There's also something crucial about what Jung called psychological boundaries and how violation triggers shutdown. Jung understood that healthy individuals have clear boundaries between self and other, knowing where they end and others begin. But some people have either weak boundaries that let everyone in, or rigid boundaries that let no one in. And sometimes boundaries get violated despite your best efforts to maintain them. When you disconnect without warning, boundaries have often been violated in ways you couldn't articulate or defend against in the moment. Perhaps the person was emotionally intrusive, demanding access to parts of you that should remain private. Perhaps they were energetically vampiric, taking more than you could afford to give. Perhaps they were psychologically enmeshed, unable to respect your separateness. The shutdown mechanism activates when your psyche determines that boundaries cannot be maintained while continuing the relationship. Withdrawal is the only way to restore boundary integrity. People who disconnect without warning often have boundary sensitivities that others don't share or understand. What feels like normal relationship depth to one person feels like violating intrusion to them. Their withdrawal protects boundaries that feel threatened in ways they often can't explain because the violations are subtle or energetic rather than overtly abusive. Jung also understood something about what he called the compensation function and how withdrawal compensates for excessive engagement. The psyche naturally compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. If you've been too engaged, too available, too externally focused, the unconscious will eventually compensate by forcing withdrawal, solitude, and inward focus. When you disconnect without warning, you're often experiencing this compensation. Your conscious attitude has been excessively engaged, and the unconscious is forcibly correcting the imbalance by shutting down external engagement and forcing you inward. The withdrawal feels sudden because compensation often builds unconsciously until it reaches critical mass and then erupts. You don't gradually reduce engagement. You suddenly can't engage anymore. People who disconnect without warning often live with extreme imbalances, oscillating between excessive engagement and complete withdrawal rather than maintaining sustainable moderate connection. The shutdown mechanism is compensation for periods of unsustainable over-engagement. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship with the collective and how toxic collective dynamics force withdrawal. Jung distinguished between healthy relationship with the collective and being overwhelmed by collective unconsciousness. Modern analysis emphasizes that as consciousness develops, participation in unconscious collective dynamics becomes unbearable. When you disconnect without warning, you've often recognized toxic collective dynamics at work. Perhaps the group operates according to unconscious patterns that you've become conscious of. Perhaps collective pressure is forcing conformity that violates your individuation. Perhaps you've suddenly seen that what appeared to be genuine community is actually unconscious collective functioning that excludes authentic individual expression. The recognition can be so disturbing that immediate withdrawal is the only bearable response. You can't stay once you've seen the unconscious collective mechanics operating. People who disconnect without warning from groups or communities have often achieved consciousness about collective dynamics that makes continued participation psychologically impossible. They're not abandoning connection. They're escaping unconscious collective forces that threaten their consciousness and individuality. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological types and how certain types particularly need periodic withdrawal. Jung identified introverted types as those whose energy naturally flows inward and who are depleted by external engagement. For deep introverts, even enjoyable social interaction drains energy that can only be restored through solitude. When you disconnect without warning, you're often a deep introvert who has exceeded your capacity for external engagement. You've given more external energy than your type can sustain, and shutdown activates to force the solitary restoration period you need. The withdrawal isn't personal rejection. It's constitutional need for the energetic restoration that your type requires. People who disconnect without warning are often introverts who don't recognize or honor their own energetic limits until they're completely depleted and withdrawal becomes unavoidable. Jung himself was deeply introverted and required extensive periods of withdrawal throughout his life. Understanding that this wasn't social dysfunction but constitutional necessity that his type demanded for psychological health and creative work. There's also something significant about what Jung called the persona and how maintaining it becomes unbearable. The persona is the social mask we wear to navigate public life, but maintaining the persona requires enormous energy, especially when there's a large gap between your persona and your authentic self. When you disconnect without warning, the cost of maintaining your persona in that relationship or situation has often become unbearable. You've been performing a version of yourself that doesn't match who you actually are, and the energy required for this performance has exceeded your capacity. The shutdown mechanism activates because continuing would require maintaining a false self that your psyche can no longer sustain. You withdraw not because you want to, but because you can't continue the exhausting performance. People who disconnect without warning often have personas that feel particularly false or that require extraordinary energy to maintain. They're not comfortable with the social performance that others manage easily. When performance costs exceed their capacity, sudden withdrawal is the only option that allows them to stop performing and return to authentic being, even if that means losing the connection. Jung also understood something about what he called active imagination and how external engagement interrupts it. Active imagination is Jung's practice of engaging consciously with unconscious material, allowing images and figures to arise and interacting with them. This practice requires solitude, quietness, and sustained inward focus. For people engaged in intensive psychological work, external relationships can interrupt essential inner processes. When you disconnect without warning, you've often entered a period of intensive inner work that external engagement would disrupt. Your psyche has prioritized inner dialogue over outer relationships, and withdrawal creates the protected space where active imagination and other inner work can occur without interruption. People who disconnect without warning are often those for whom inner psychological work is primary, and who must sometimes ruthlessly protect it from external demands. They're not avoiding relationship. They're engaging in profound inner relationship that external connections would prevent. Jung spent extended periods in deliberate isolation during his most intensive inner work, understanding that certain psychological processes simply cannot happen while maintaining normal social engagement. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the shadow of relationship itself. Every relationship, every form of connection, has its own shadow. The hidden costs, the unacknowledged dynamics, the dark undercurrents that aren't visible on the surface. When you disconnect without warning, you've often suddenly become conscious of a relationship's shadow. Perhaps you've recognized that what appeared to be mutual care was actually codependence. Perhaps you've seen that what felt like love was actually need or fear. Perhaps you've understood that the relationship was based on unconscious patterns rather than genuine connection. This sudden consciousness of the relationship's shadow can make continuation impossible. You can't unsee what you've seen, and staying would require pretending you don't see the shadow dynamics now visible to you. People who disconnect without warning often have moments of stark clarity, where relationship shadows become suddenly visible, and the recognition makes immediate withdrawal necessary. They're not being cruel. They're responding to awareness that fundamentally changes the meaning and sustainability of the connection. Let's also consider what Jung understood about what he called the transcendent function and how it sometimes requires radical change. The transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to generate new possibilities by holding tension between opposites. But sometimes this function generates insights or directions that require complete breaks with existing patterns. When you disconnect without warning, the transcendent function has often generated understanding that continuation is impossible, that the relationship or situation must end for new possibilities to emerge. The withdrawal isn't failure or dysfunction. It's response to transcendent insight about what must happen for your development to continue. People who disconnect without warning are often following transcendent function guidance that their rational conscious mind doesn't fully understand, but that comes from deeper psychological wisdom about what's necessary. Jung trusted the transcendent function's guidance even when it led to socially inappropriate or painful actions, understanding that the psyche's creative wisdom sometimes demands radical change. There's also something profound about what Jung called psychological wounds and trauma responses. Jung recognized that past trauma creates lasting changes in how the psyche functions, particularly around safety and threat detection. When you disconnect without warning, trauma responses have often been activated. Something in the current situation has triggered past wounding, and your nervous system has interpreted current circumstances as dangerous based on past experience. The shutdown mechanism is trauma protection, the freeze or flight response activating to prevent retraumatization. The withdrawal appears sudden and inexplicable to others because they don't see the internal trauma response occurring. People who disconnect without warning often carry significant trauma that makes them hypersensitive to certain dynamics or behaviors. What others experience as normal relationship intensity registers as threat for them, triggering protective withdrawal. Jung would approach this with compassion, understanding that trauma responses are automatic protective mechanisms rather than conscious choices, and that healing trauma rather than just controlling withdrawal behavior is what's required. Jung also understood something about what he called synchronicity and meaningful coincidences. Sometimes withdrawal happens because of synchronistic events, meaningful patterns that signal it's time to disconnect. You might suddenly notice multiple signs or coincidences that all point toward ending the relationship. You might have a dream that makes continuation feel impossible. You might encounter external events that seem to be orchestrating your withdrawal. When you disconnect without warning, synchronistic patterns have often been building, creating overwhelming sense that withdrawal is cosmically necessary or fated, even if you can't rationally explain why. People who disconnect without warning are often highly attuned to synchronistic patterns and trust them as guidance from the unconscious or from larger patterns of meaning that exceed rational understanding. Jung devoted significant attention to synchronicity and trusted such patterns in his own life, understanding that they represent meaningful connections between inner and outer reality that rational causality doesn't explain. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the collective shadow and how recognizing it forces withdrawal. The collective shadow is the darkness that entire cultures or groups refuse to acknowledge. When you become conscious of collective shadow material operating in a group or relationship, continued participation can become impossible. Perhaps you've suddenly seen the unconscious racism, sexism, or cruelty operating beneath the surface. Perhaps you've recognized the collective denial or projection that everyone else remains blind to. Once you've seen collective shadow material, you can't unsee it, and participating feels like complicity. The shutdown mechanism activates to separate you from collective shadow dynamics that you can no longer unconsciously participate in. People who disconnect without warning from groups or communities have often achieved consciousness about collective shadow that makes them unable to continue participating. They're not being judgmental or superior. They're protecting themselves from being implicated in collective darkness they can now see clearly. Let's also consider what Jung called the relationship with death and how mortality awareness affects connection. Jung emphasized that confronting death fundamentally changes priorities and values. When you've genuinely confronted mortality, when you understand that life is finite and precious, tolerance for inauthentic or draining relationships disappears. When you disconnect without warning, you've often had a mortality awareness breakthrough that makes you realize you can't afford to spend your limited time in connections that don't serve your genuine development or that violate your authentic nature. The withdrawal isn't rejection. It's recognition that life is too short for relationships that aren't truly nourishing or aligned with who you actually are. People who disconnect without warning often have strong mortality awareness that makes them ruthlessly protective of their finite time and energy. They're not being selfish. They're honoring the preciousness and brevity of life by refusing to waste it on connections that don't genuinely matter. Jung's own confrontation with death shaped his understanding of what deserved his limited time and energy. There's also something significant about what Jung called the religious function and how it requires periodic withdrawal. The religious function, in Jung's understanding, is the innate human need for connection with meaning, transcendence, or the sacred. This function often requires withdrawal from ordinary social life to be properly served. When you disconnect without warning, your religious function has often demanded attention that continued engagement would prevent. You need time for contemplation, for spiritual practice, for encounter with what matters most deeply. The withdrawal creates sacred space that relationship obligations would fill. People who disconnect without warning are often those for whom the religious function is particularly strong and who must periodically withdraw from social life to serve their spiritual or meaning-making needs. They're not abandoning human connection. They're prioritizing connection with the transcendent that requires solitude and withdrawal from ordinary social functioning. Jung himself required extensive periods of withdrawal for his own religious and spiritual development. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called the individuation process and its phases. Jung recognized that individuation doesn't happen linearly, but moves through phases, including phases of necessary withdrawal and isolation that alternate with phases of engagement and integration. When you disconnect without warning, you've often entered a withdrawal phase that your individuation process requires. This phase might involve shadow work that needs privacy, inner reorganization that external engagement would disrupt, or development of capacities that can only emerge in solitude. The withdrawal isn't permanent rejection, but temporary necessary separation that your development demands. People who disconnect without warning are often cycling through individuation phases that require periodic complete withdrawal followed by re-engagement. Understanding this cyclical nature can help both the person withdrawing and those affected by the withdrawal recognize it as developmental necessity rather than personal rejection or dysfunction. In the end, the real reason you disconnect without warning is multifaceted, but fundamentally about psychological self-preservation and development. You're responding to energy depletion that has reached critical levels. You're becoming conscious of projection dynamics that make genuine relating impossible. You're experiencing pain from consciousness gaps that make continued engagement unbearable. You're protecting yourself from shadow confrontation you're not ready for. You're responding to activated complexes that hijack behavior. You're serving individuation that requires ruthless separation. You're following self-guidance that exceeds ego understanding. You're protecting violated boundaries. You're compensating for excessive engagement. You're escaping toxic collective dynamics. You're honoring introverted energy needs. You're stopping unsustainable persona performance. You're protecting inner work that external engagement disrupts. You're responding to sudden consciousness of relationship shadows. You're following transcendent function guidance. You're experiencing trauma responses that require withdrawal. You're trusting synchronistic patterns. You're refusing complicity in collective shadow. You're honoring mortality awareness. You're serving religious function, and you're moving through individuation phases that require temporary isolation. Carl Jung would not pathologize your disconnection, but recognize it as the psyche's wisdom operating to protect and develop you in ways that conscious understanding often doesn't comprehend until much later. He would understand that sudden withdrawal, while socially problematic and often painful for others, frequently serves essential psychological functions that cannot be achieved while maintaining connection. He would distinguish between withdrawal as avoidance or dysfunction and withdrawal as necessary response to genuine psychological need or developmental imperative. And he would encourage exploring what your withdrawal pattern is serving, what it's protecting, what it's enabling, rather than simply judging it as bad behavior that should be eliminated. Your tendency to disconnect without warning might be problematic in some ways, might cause legitimate pain to others, might indicate unresolved trauma or unintegrated complexes that deserve therapeutic attention. But it might also be your psyche's intelligent response to circumstances that genuinely require withdrawal, your protection of boundaries and energy that others don't respect, your service of individuation and development that continued engagement would prevent. The work isn't necessarily to stop disconnecting, but to become more conscious about when and why you disconnect, to understand the patterns and triggers, to communicate when possible, and to trust that your psyche's shutdown mechanism, even when it operates without conscious control or warning, is attempting to serve your wholeness and development in the only way it knows how. Jung himself withdrew from society during crucial periods, understanding that certain developmental work simply cannot happen while maintaining normal social functioning, and that honoring these withdrawal needs, even when they appear antisocial or create conflict, is sometimes the most psychologically honest and necessary choice you can make. Your disconnection without warning isn't just a character flaw or bad habit. It's a complex psychological phenomenon that deserves understanding rather than simple judgment, that often contains wisdom about what you need, even when that wisdom operates beneath conscious awareness. And that might be protecting or serving aspects of your psychological development that are more important than maintaining comfortable social connections that violate your deeper needs and authentic nature.